So today we have Jody Gray, and she is currently the director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences. Jody has worked in the arena of equity, diversity, and inclusion for over 15 years, and previously she was the Diversity Outreach Librarian for the University of Minnesota Libraries. She's also been the director of the Office of Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services at the American Library Association in Chicago. Jody is also an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Lakota tribe of South Dakota. So thank you very much for being here, Jody, and I'll let you have the floor.
All right, can you hear me okay? All right, great. We're all at the mercy of the technology. And I have 3 screens up, so you're gonna see me looking in different directions, and that's why. But thank you for inviting me to be here today. I'm gonna share my screen right now because I have a PowerPoint that I'm gonna go over with you all. So let's get that going. All right, so as Wesley said, I am an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River tribe. I actually grew up in South Dakota on the reservation. My family all still lives there. I'm a first generation undergraduate, graduate, and I have my master's in library and information science. I am a cisgender female, heterosexual. You know, I'm also mixed race. I've, you know, Lakota and white. And I always like to start every session kind of just laying that out, like to let you know, here are the lenses that I'm bringing to the conversation. And I think that's really important when we're doing this work, to recognize the importance of our identities and how it impacts how we do the work. So I'm going to be talking about anti-racism work in higher education today. We will hopefully have some time to chat in smaller groups, but I want to, in that vein, want to start out with some grounding assumptions that we are here to learn and do our best. I hope that everybody can be cognizant of the space that you occupy. So, you know, when we get to the Q&A or you have comments that you want, just be cognizant of how much space you're taking. And you know, some people are more comfortable actually talking. Others, I encourage you to use the chat box. But the more voices we hear, the more powerful the session is. Assume good intentions. So we're all here because we want to learn, as we said at the beginning. And I think that everybody is coming to this with good intentions, but recognize that intent is not the same as impact. And when that happens, you know, we think of those as mistakes. We need to acknowledge those and grow and move on. And then finally, we're all responsible for this space. Especially, I use this one a lot now that we're in Zoom too, because I need everyone to be paying attention and recognizing if something's going on, I'm not always going to be able to see it. So we're all going to hold each other accountable to these grounding assumptions for today. Okay, so I'm going to just jump into it. I have a lot of stuff to talk about in terms of engaging in the work of anti-racism in higher ed, because it is something that is more common right now, or has a lot of focus on it. And one of the things I think is important when you do this work is to recognize that the work evolves. And so if we think about, and this is, you know, if we think about the beginning of how we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what we could say, the beginning framework was really freedom, right? To just have our freedoms, whatever your identity was here in the United States. And, you know, that has culminated in civil rights movements amongst various groups, whether it's African Americans, people of color, American Indians, women, the LGBTQ community. In the last 20 or so years, maybe 30, what you see is this progression about the way that we talk about this work. So, you know, we really had this equality lens for many years. We started talking about microaggressions and implicit bias along with social justice. The distinction there being social justice is really about all oppressed identities and also about power dynamics. We'll talk a little bit about that, but how that plays out through things like microaggressions and implicit bias. We've moved from an equality sort of framework to an equity framework, meaning we're not, you know, equality being everybody gets the same, equity being people get what they actually need. And now we're seeing this push towards anti-racism. All of these are not new concepts. They've been around for decades. And, you know, when we pay attention to them in higher ed and where they become useful is what I think is important for us to recognize. And like in this moment right now, we have a lot of focus on anti-racism. However, that's not the work we've been doing as a university. So one thing that is really helpful to understand is the way that we use the language around this work, because it's both fluid and abstract and elusive. And sometimes we are using the language, but not truly understanding if the people that we're talking to are defining it or working with that language in the same way that we are as individuals. And so then you can get a lot of miscommunication. So what I have here is this model that I've used for years, which is the diversity, cultural competency, and social justice framework model. And basically what you see here is, if we think about diversity, not defined as what is a diverse person or a diverse population, but as a framework for the work we want to do, then diversity framework is really about creating an understanding and an appreciation for culture and social differences. So it's about awareness. And for a long time, we've spent a lot of time just being like, we need to be aware that there are these cultural differences. And that's a place a lot of people start. And then the next level is really cultural competency, which is about moving beyond just awareness to actually effectively interacting with people of different backgrounds and cultures. And in fact, the CFANS community has done a lot of work on intercultural competency over the years, but cultural competency is not just about international relations, it's about all cultures. And then, like I said, social justice is about focusing on power dynamics among different groups while acknowledging historical and institutional inequities. The thing you want to recognize is all of these frameworks are intertwined with each other. And so that's what this little circular model is. And we use a circular model too, because these are lifelong efforts that are in play, and you will find that throughout the life of an organization or throughout your own personal life, you may be focusing on different elements here. The other thing I always like to remind people too is some of these things rely on each other to be successful. So what I mean by that is you can have diversity in your organization as a framework in terms of awareness and even cultural competency kind of on their own. But you can't really have social justice if you don't have a grounding in the diversity and the cultural competency. So you need them all to be together. And like I said, the model that the University of Minnesota has had the entire time that I've been doing the work, so starting back in 2005 when I was in the libraries, is this social justice model. And you see that in the language. So the Office for Equity and Diversity, which is the university's central office, actually uses our commitment to social justice in the way that they talk about the values. And so once again, recognizing that social justice as a framework is really about recognizing, and there's a real push for this, especially back in 2005, to say it's not just about race. It's about gender identity, it's about sexual identity, it's about ability, class, you know, all these different things needing to be addressed, but not just addressed as an awareness with the social justice model that like, okay, how does an institution or a system perpetuate the way that oppression plays out amongst all of those communities. So the new kid on the block, not really, because once again, anti-racism is not new, but the way and how we're talking about it at CFANS and at the university is something that we're all on this journey together. We don't have a clear roadmap of exactly what that looks like. But the distinction between anti-racism and social justice is really anti-racism does center race. and in the work that is done. And it uses a lot of the same principles as social justice in terms of we need to look at policies, we need to look at systems, but it's about actively opposing the racist policies and advocating for changes in our political, economic, and social lives. So it really targets that with the idea that if we can tear down the barriers in this way for racial communities, then that actually helps all communities. So it also requires that we start using language that we're not really that comfortable using, which is saying when things are racist or not racist. So Ibram X. Kendi, who has been around once again with scholarship for a long, long time. I know many of you maybe have read How to Be an Anti-Racist. The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. And so, you know, the principle here is it's not about just saying, well, I don't do anything I'm not the reason that these policies exist. It's that to be anti-racist means you have to take action. You have to be a part of the conversation and you have a role. And so that's one piece that's really important when we talk about anti-racism, is it is action. So it is actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in those political, economic, and social settings. And the thing about anti-racism is it is an individualized approach. And it's set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. So what does that mean? What that means is you can't really, like when we say, okay, we now want to start doing anti-racism work, if we know, and this is true, whether we want to accept it or not, that there are people in our college, in our university, in our state, in our country, in the world, who haven't even gotten to the diversity framework, who don't even recognize that there is difference in the world. So, so we have to, as organizations, begin to recognize we can't go completely from one end to the other without doing a lot of internal individual work in the meantime, because there's plenty of things that we can address and that we can ask experts around. You know, we can hire consultants who are like anti-racism experts to come in and like look at our policies and give us suggestions. But if we're going to change the culture, that requires individuals needing to understand these frameworks, and that requires a lot of individual work and self-reflection and self-awareness. And that is the action that is often the first type of action that needs to be happening. And it's also being able to think about what are racist actions and what are the characteristics of white supremacy, and not, you know, and these are, once again, these are words and language that kind of make us uncomfortable, and we probably have a lot of ideas about and assumptions about what white supremacy is. But when we're talking about this in the terms of the frameworks and the work we have to do, white supremacy culture is really those behaviors that allow for oppression to continue within a system. And we know that in the United States, white supremacy culture is what has driven the way that our current environment is. And so if we can understand and sort of deconstruct how that works, how it continues to succeed, then we can hopefully take actions against it. So some of the characteristics of white supremacy are this idea of perfectionism, and you see this a lot in higher ed. We're not going to speak up, or we're not going to be in the conversation until we know that we can do it perfectly, or that we're going to be the most articulate person. That means that there are a lot of voices that aren't being heard, that need to be heard. So we need to move away from this idea that you have to be perfect to talk about this stuff. A sense of urgency. There's often a lot of distraction when it comes to the work of anti-racism, in terms of white supremacy likes to keep us in a state of we have to react to every incident, so that we're never able to like actually strategize or come together in a structured way. White supremacy culture tends to have defensiveness. This is what drives the perfectionism and the ability not to speak out, as we know that when we start talking about things like racism, people get defensive and we want to avoid conflict. The idea that there's only one right way and binary thinking are also linked together. So assuming that, you know, that there is a right and wrong way to do things is also a way that the white supremacy culture has continued to transcend time. But if you think about, and I think about my relationship in tribal communities, in particular, when I try and think about how to explain this binary thinking, because I know that there are a lot of people who want Indigenous rights, and we talk about that a lot at CFANS, especially because of some of the history of our industries here and how they've impacted the Indigenous communities. And we tend to think, okay, if we just stop doing one thing and do this other thing, or just stop doing something, then we're done, then the problem is solved. And if you really start interacting with communities, you begin to realize, well, actually, that thing that we needed to do is only relevant to maybe 1 or 2 of the 11 tribes. You know, we're not a monolith. And so we need to have a more nuanced conversation and be able to have those. So how do you begin to actually engage with this work? So like I said, it is very individualized, like you need to do a lot of the work. And I sort of lay 3 things that I always encourage people to explore. And these are things that, you know, the university offers some trainings, and our office for CFANS is happy to offer some, but it really is reliant on you as an individual to sort of take on the task, like here's the action, the task of like exploring these areas for yourself. And the 3 areas that I think, if you want to be doing social justice, anti-racism work, you have to have self-awareness, you have to understand the historical context around you, and you have to have emotional intelligence. So let's break those down. So self-awareness. This is really that individual learning. So once again, there are plenty of workshops on campus that anyone can go to for free around implicit bias, around privilege, around microaggressions. So we encourage you to attend and do those things. And many people at the university, you know, it's a part of the work. And so you can do it, you know, on work hours and all of that. At the same time, there's just an enormous amount of free access in the world to exploring these issues. If you type in implicit bias or privilege or microaggressions, you're gonna get, you know, 100 different YouTube videos, TED Talks, whatever, that will help you to start down the journey. And in fact, the Kirwan Institute has an implicit bias module series that allows you as an individual to go through. You actually can take the implicit bias assessment, and then, you know, things like privilege. There's the Privilege Institute, which actually holds national conferences that talks about white privilege, but also talks about all kinds of privilege, whether it's cisgender privilege, whether it's ability, you know, everybody has a sense of privilege. So there are many ways that you can start to explore that, and that is really important for you to understand where your implicit biases lie and your privilege lies. So the historical context, you need to start to understand the distinction of our individual bias, and then how that individual bias may or may not be aligned with the institutional racism, sexism, ableism, so on, that may exist within your department, within the college, within the university, within higher ed in general. So you want to start thinking and having some understanding of what is the historical context of the areas of which you study, who is involved. You know, you don't need to be, once again, you don't need to be an expert. This is not like you need to get a whole other degree, but a sense of these is really important. And then recognizing the distinction between assimilation and acculturation. So for many, many years, you know, like the equality sort of model really pushed for an assimilation model, which is we're going to give you all the same thing and we're going to expect that everybody can do everything the same, but it's all going to be evaluated and based on a norm that the dominant group has decided. And then acculturation is really when you find space for bringing your own identity and different identities into a space to start to build inclusion. The structural context is, you know, really thinking about oppression and how it works within our systems and structures. And that the way that it works is by setting up these dualistic frames that privilege some groups and exclude others. So we need to deconstruct those binaries. Like, once again, this goes back to, you need to understand that that's a white supremacy culture, to deconstruct binaries and recognize individual and social complexities and varieties that they can hide. And that's an important tool for change, just recognizing and being able to speak to, this is what's happening. And then emotional intelligence, you know, there's a whole field out there right now that does a lot of emotional intelligence work. I encourage you to look into it, but it's really about our emotional awareness, or the ability to identify and name our own emotions, which ties back to our self-awareness and our recognition of our implicit bias and our privilege. Emotional intelligence goes on, though, to talk about our ability to harness the emotions that we feel and apply them to a task, like thinking and problem solving. So not letting emotions take over, but recognizing the value that they may serve in whatever task we're trying to resolve. And then the ability to manage emotions, including regulating one's own emotions when necessary and helping others to do the same. So when we talk about race, we talk about white supremacy. Once again, there's like a visceral emotional reaction that we have. So we have to recognize that, and that some people are shutting down the second you say those words. And so how do you keep people in a space and being able to manage? Once you begin to manage and have an understanding of how your emotions are working, it helps you to manage those spaces. And then if we think about the structures in which we are working, we have to recognize that there are levels of influence and hierarchies that we are within in terms of the work that we're doing within higher ed. So this is moving away. This is not so much self-awareness as it is thinking about, okay, what is the structure? Understanding our structure in an organization is so important if you actually want to change it. So people need to understand, what is the University of Minnesota? How do the colleges actually align or fit into what a university is? What is the distinction between those two entities, or many entities? That within colleges, there's also academic programs, there's student services, there's programs, and all of them are doing work towards, you know, our goal. And what you often hear is like, we're student first, we're about getting, you know, people their degrees, getting people access to higher education, encouraging people to go on to master's and PhD programs. And all of those align and are what each of these different levels are kind of working towards, but there are levels of oppression that are happening at each one of these levels that need to be addressed. And sometimes they can be addressed when it is very localized, but sometimes the bigger things tend to have to go up to, like, it's beyond a college, it's beyond the university. In fact, sometimes, you know, you can even go outside of the university to be like, the university has to align itself sometimes with some state or federal issues that are happening. So that's an important thing to recognize if you want to do this work. I just wanted, the next few slides are a little bit about how the structure at CFANS is. exists right now. So especially around diversity and inclusion. So CFANS is the first and at this moment, I think the only college within the University of Minnesota Twin Cities that has its own office. There are people who have positions within student services or human resources that are diversity and inclusion related, but CFANS has had the Office for Diversity and Inclusion since 2007, and that has provided a structure that allows for a lot of what I would call development for the college, whether we're helping develop our leadership, our faculty, our staff, that we are able to explore and figure out ways to do that through workshops, consultations, but we also, once again, are cognizant of building communities and recruitment and retention around students of color, Indigenous students. And we work with different departments who are also trying to do that work. In terms of what the work looks like at the college level, there is around diversity and inclusion and the areas that are starting to manage, are starting to have the conversation about anti-racism. There's our office. There's also a collegiate committee on diversity and inclusion, which is an appointed group under the college's FCC, the Faculty Consultative Committee, I think is what that stands for. And it is made up of representatives from faculty, from staff, civil service, bargaining units, P&A. We have representatives who are undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs. And so that group meets and is actually charged with advising and providing insights to leadership. And then within the departments, at this moment, I know of 10 departmental diversity committees. So when I got here, I think there were 8 when I've been here about a year, and now there are 10, and I feel like some more are kind of coming into existence or trying to track that. So we know that there's people within each department who are also doing this work. And then we also have a CFANS Diversity Community of Practice, which is a new group that is intended to communicate amongst all of these groups, because we're all trying to do the same thing, but if we're not doing it together, it really hinders our progress. The next couple of slides, I just want to say, like, some of the things I think that are important as we think about like how we want to do anti-racism work and how challenging it can be, is even just looking at how do we currently talk about what we want to happen at the college. So there's this roadmap to excellence, which has been around for a while, although I'm always surprised some people don't know that it exists, but this has been around. It was something that I was given to help me in my strategic planning. But, you know, the language here is that the University of Minnesota vision to be preeminent in solving the grand challenges of a diverse and changing world. Well, that's a very vague statement. Depending on how you, once again, define diversity and the work that happens in diversity, that can both be seen as good or bad. One, it allows us to have it's not prescriptive, so it allows us to explore these things on our own, but it also doesn't really give us a lot of direction when it's really vague like that. And the same for in the strategies that we have, there's the build a diverse and inclusive environment. But what is that? Like, there's no direction. Once again, what is diverse for CFANS? What is diverse for a department? Those might look different. And it is one piece of this many bullets that are listed here, when really, if we want to talk about social justice and anti-racism, it should be impacting all of these areas. Every single bullet should have an element where we're talking about the social justice aspect of it and the anti-racism or restorative justice or whatever we're going to decide to move forward. But that's how, if we think about what's happening at the college, like right now, that's where we're at. I will say that I'm on the Dean's Council. I got added to the Dean's Council this summer, and we are talking about bringing in a consultant to do a diversity strategic plan for the college. that will provide a bit more of a strategy that the departments and the units can plug into, so that we can all be working towards the same thing and not realigning it or redeveloping it in every single department or unit. The other thing that we need to recognize that I alluded to earlier is also around the reflection of our history. And so, you know, CFANS has its own history that we have to contend with. And, you know, you and your department are hopefully addressing these things. But, you know, over the years, looking at the economics, the land issues, how labor within agriculture, within the different industries over in CFANS have played out, and who's been oppressed or not, our food, access to food, the way that we manage food, all of those, and our climate, whether it's actual like climate change, or the climate of you know, how we feel welcome or not welcome in our college, university departments. All of those things are areas that we really, if we want to move forward, especially with social justice and anti-racism, we really need to dig into these and figure out an approach to actually move forward. And so what I have next, this is kind of how the model that I use and have used in other organizations. It's, once again, this is not we're never gonna necessarily just resolve everything, but I think what we can do is think about how do we actually start to look at those historical issues within CFANS, within your department. How do we address them? We have to give time to reflect on what's happening. And that will inform, hopefully, the way that we try and dismantle and then transform the work that we're doing. And so these are kind of like the 4 stages I think are helpful for us when we're trying within an organization to shift the culture. So when we're talking about addressing issues, really this is, we have to be able to respond whenever something happens. We have to, which means that our leaders and all of us need to understand these frameworks of equity, diversity, and inclusion. What are the current practices, processes, and things that are in place when we begin to address issues? We need to communicate. Communication is so key. Whenever we talk about diversity and inclusion, you know, the default in an organization is an assumption that nobody cares and nothing is happening. And that is honestly rarely the case. But we don't hear about it because we don't talk about the conversations, the hard conversations that are happening. This is where our emotional intelligence plays a big part in managing how we're having these conversations together. And hopefully in anything, we're moving towards a sustainable and long-term strategy, that should always be at the center of how we're trying to address something, not just a one and done sort of solution. And then, you know, once we're done with that addressing something stage, we have to think about what did we learn? What barriers and strengths did we uncover? What changes do we actually need to make? And what do we need for the future? Like, those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves and giving ourselves time to do, which does not happen very often. We usually are just reacting and then moving on to the next thing we need to react to, and with very little time for reflecting. But that also then, once we start to uncover the barriers, then we can start to dismantle. So we can start to acknowledge the current and historical wrongdoings, to understand how our personal lens and has impacted the work, and question our own thoughts and behaviors. It helps us to jettison this belief in a hierarchy of human value, which is another sort of driving force of white supremacy culture. We don't like to talk about it, but all of these, you know, when you talk about race and gender, are cultural uh, constructs, that means that we have assigned a value to individual identity points, and the world is built on those. So we need to jettison that. We need to ask ourselves whose reality is being centered. We need to be willing to be uncomfortable, and once again, we have to understand the white supremacy culture characteristics that exist. And hopefully through all of that, what we can do, and hopefully, is start to transform. And transforming also, we don't give ourselves a lot of time for this, includes allowing us to heal. So finding space for healing, finding a space to recognize the common humanity within each other, a time to acknowledge, you know, how our current and historical wrongs have impacted the world, and try and reconcile those if at all possible, and then hopefully build a shared history that moves us forward. So, and then you kind of like go back to the beginning, and you see where you're at, and you're like, okay, did we address it correctly? You might end up having to go through this cycle a couple of times, but I do find that more often than not, organizations get stuck here. We get stuck in addressing issues, and we don't ever really move beyond that. And so that is something that I think if we want to do social justice, anti-racism work, then we have to build in space for these next levels. Okay, that's all the information I'm going to throw at you. Let's see how we doing on time. I have, if there are any questions, that if people want to ask questions right now, put it in the chat box or unmute and ask your question. Otherwise, or during this, I'd like to break us into rooms and have us talk about these prompts. Have you discuss how to build an anti-racist culture by talking about what is your role, what is your department's role, what is the college's role, what is the university's role, now that you've had the content that I've provided. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll see where we're at in terms of questions.
Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Jody, I have a question for you. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. This is great. What I sometimes feel when we're talking about anti-racism especially is that when we highlight something that's really, whether it's our society or our college or a work unit, something that's wrong, there becomes a lot of emphasis on this wrongdoing, wrong action, racist tendency. And I sometimes get drug into this negativity trap with like focusing on the wrong pieces and how people are doing it wrong. And I'm wondering if you have strategies or how we can also tie that to something that is sort of a role modeling behavior, like here's what we're doing wrong, let's attack that. But then also here's approaches that are the right way, and kind of keep ourselves balanced or out of just the negative.
Yeah, well, I think that's wherein I talk about those pieces we never get to. That's kind of where that lives. When we talk about giving ourselves time to reflect and time to transform, that's when we can say, okay, what did we do that was right? What worked? How can we replicate that? How can we be in community with each other? But like I said, you're absolutely right. We get stuck in the like problem solving space, and not only do we get stuck there, we're happy to just be there. Like that's what we're comfortable with. That's what we're used to. And so I think the challenge then is to help us as a college, as a community that wants to do this work, to figure out how to build the space in for the pieces around reflection and transformation. The thing that I think there's a whole like, what's it called, like positive inquiry sort of model, asset-based approach to the work, which is something that I do think is a good way. Like when you're starting out, you know, I think it's good to recognize and see, like, here are the things that that we know have been successful, because the truth is, you know, it feels like the college is being horrible, and there are probably many horrible, you know, policies and practices that are still happening that we have to address. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been movement, and we should be proud of that movement, and we should recognize that the people who were here before us were fighting for that movement. Like I think about, but that's hard. That's a hard space. You have to really, like, here's where your self-awareness sort of comes into play too. So you can be like, okay, well, how do I build that in for myself? But I think about when I was here back in the libraries, 2005, there were no gender neutral bathrooms on campus, not one. And for years we fought, we need a map, we need buildings on every single campus to have gender neutral bathrooms. And that happened, you know, over many years that happened. And I left, I went away for 4 years and came back, and I look around and I'm like, this is great. You even see signage, you know, and buildings that you see. But one of the first things that happened was a student came to my office and said, there aren't enough gender neutral bathrooms on this campus. And you know what, they're right. But I can also, you know, so we need to figure out how to do that. But I can also appreciate that there was success, that there was nothing before. But, you know, we don't really, once again, like, share those moments. I don't know, does that sort of address what you were asking?
Yeah, it does. That's great. Kind of highlighting that we have made progress and we have more progress to make at the same time.
Yes.
I have kind of maybe a related question to Mike's. I think, you know, another thing that is really difficult to reconcile sometimes for me is, you know, during the sort of acknowledgement step, there are so many, you know, just kind of just horrific things that have happened in the past, right? We have like a really, really difficult history that is just, so, you know, getting stuck in the past is understandable in that sense to a certain extent. But I think one thing that I wonder about is, you know, how do you productively acknowledge these past wrongs, but also, you know, make sure that you're focusing on present problems as well. You know, I guess I'm thinking about that, just that time difference as far as action goes, you know. And I guess maybe to be more specific, I'm thinking about how universities have taken land, for example, right? Like we're at a university that wasn't on our land, and that is the current state of affairs. So like, what do we, how do we talk about that, and what do we, you know, what do we do about it? And I think that's really challenging for me to think about.
No, it is. And you know, one thing, so and this, I have been trained most of my life with the social justice model, I will say. So this anti-racism work is, I'm also on this journey with people. I will say that it is, you know, it is a reflection of the current climate within the country more than anything. We see, you know, Black Lives Matter is centering the work. And I think that does need to happen at this moment, and that is anti-racist work. But to be perfectly honest, and here's where we need to reflect on what is the best for the college. In my role, like thinking about that and helping the college move forward, I think there is a space for anti-racism, but I honestly think we need to do more restorative justice, which gets at exactly what you're talking about, which is, how are you in community with the people who you've harmed? How do you recognize and take ownership of the harm that has happened, and also heal together? And you know, and that is a different model that we haven't explored or haven't talked about. But that's, I think, pieces that we also need to do, because, you know, and CFANS, I think, is unique in that because it is a college, like I come from liberal arts, so things are not as, you know, tied to physical space. And things here at CFANS are tied to physical spaces and physical world things. And so I think that there is maybe some opportunity for us to think about that as a future direction, you know, and that's something, if we bring in this bring in a consultant for strategic planning with us, that I would want us to approach with that person and be like, okay, where would, you know, a college with these issues and this history best be served? And I don't think that what you're talking about does get addressed in a social justice or anti-racist model in the same way, because it kind of pulls out the relationship part of the work and really focuses on the systems, the policies, the structural aspects.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
We only have 11 minutes, so I'm hesitant to put us in breakout rooms. So I don't know, or are there questions in the chat?
There's a couple questions in the chat, and I'm happy to read them out loud so everyone can hear them. Carolyn Weston asks, hi Jody, can you give an example of a successful transformation from a past experience of yours with engaging anti-racism?
Well, like I said, I'm more familiar with social justice than anti-racism in terms of my practice in my career. So, but I can talk about that. So when I was at the American Library Association, which is a professional association for libraries nationally. So we served public libraries, academic libraries, all the different libraries. And like any professional association, you know, a big chunk of the work happened in professional development and in our conferences. We held 2 conferences every year. And before I went to Chicago, I was a member of the American Library Association. And in 2012, after Trayvon Martin was shot, the Black Caucus of the American Library Association looked ahead at, so that was 2012. In 2016, the national conference was supposed to be held in Orlando, Florida. And they said, we do not want that. We do not feel safe. We want this organization, to pull out of that, to demonstrate that you are supporting and caring about, you know, Black lives. And the association, you know, if you ever do association work, you're like tied into these like huge contracts that have major penalties that could cause real damage if you're not an association that has a lot of money. So they had to deal with that aspect, and in the end, they decided, no, we cannot do that because it's going to cause too much harm. But what we can do is actually ask our members to help us understand for future how to build in sort of channels where we recognize that these things are happening and that we need to be addressing them at every conference that we go to. So it took a couple of years. They had a committee. The committee came up with like 70 some recommendations of like, this is what needs to happen at every conference. And so when I got to ALA, you know, we got those 77 recommendations. Our office went through them, figured out like, what does it look like to actually implement these? And then every single conference, we would have a report on where we were. And so in terms of like transforming the culture, you went from people who were still upset, you know, that we had the conference in Orlando, Florida, but you suddenly also had a lot of people who were more engaged with how to make every conference more inclusive, and recognize that no matter what city or state we're in, there are going to be issues that are causing harm to some part of our population. And so I sort of see that as a transformational way that association, but that took a year. It was not a, you know, one summer we did something, came up with an idea that was years of intentional talking spaces, doing the work, reporting about it, communicating about it. And it continues after I left. So that's maybe one example I have of what I feel like was success. There's still a lot of work that they need to do, but I felt like I saw a change.
Sarah Nelson posted another question. Jody, can you comment on the situation with the Native American Medicine Garden? I have been very disappointed with the college's lack of communication about its decision to terminate Francis Bedaloon and refusal to engage in a community dialogue around the garden. To me, this appears like an example for a perfect opportunity of restorative justice in building/repairing community.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that that is a perfect example of where restorative justice and repairing the community is absolutely needed. I can't really comment on it. And just to be perfectly frank, I'm actually, Francis reports to me, and so it is an issue that I can't talk about. But I agree with you that, and I've pushed, because I do think we need to communicate more about what is happening. What I can say is we have been having conversations. It just gets complicated when you bring, oh my gosh, so sorry. When you get personnel issues intertwined, because there are so many privacy things that we have to be cognizant of that kind of keep us from communicating. And what I will say is we are still working through it. Francis is still employed at the University of Minnesota. Yeah, I know that's pretty unsatisfying, but I do think that, you know, at a certain point, there's no way we can't move forward and need to do some sort of healing, restorative justice piece. So there are about 5 minutes left. I don't know if there are other questions in the chat that, or any other comments people have at this point.
Jody, I have one more question. So for me in the past, I'm thinking about anti-racism and anti-racism actions I could have taken. They often feel very uncomfortable, and they, to me, feel like confrontational. I'm curious if we have resources in college and departments or lower levels that might help us point out the actions we can take, the anti-racist actions we can take, without having that same level of sort of a confrontational feel, or maybe that confrontational feel is important. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about becoming comfortable with the confrontation, because I think that's the part we have to address, and you know, figuring out ways to not address it means it just sort of sticks around. That being said, there is, when I talked about the CFANS structure, the CFANS Diversity Community of Practice, that is open to any member of CFANS who is doing this work, wants to lead in this work. Is, you know, it's a volunteer group. We meet once a month, and for 90 minutes, and in that 90 minutes we share communications about what's happening across the college, but then we spend an hour doing professional development. Like, how do you have these conversations? How does my office provide skills and the ability to actually challenge, have these challenging conversations. So that's one thing that anybody can join. You just have to email me or my office and we'll add you to the list. We have about 140 people who are in that right now. That group also decided to do lunch and learn. So once a month, somebody from the group leads a session on these issues to get us you know, able to start talking about them and just get comfortable with that uncomfortable feeling. And then the university itself has a lot of, you know, the Equity and Diversity Certificate from the Office for Equity and Diversity has 10 workshops, like once again, that are really lay out the foundational things you need to know if you want to be. Once again, those were built with a social justice lens in mind, but they are, I know, trying to build in more anti-racism stuff, but those are free and open to anyone. My office heard when I got here that they're really hard to get into. They're pretty popular. So we did partner with OED, and now we have a version, like we use their curriculum. We offer it to only CFANS people. So if you get like the insider, or if you go to our website, you can sign up for them. They've also, you know, filled up really fast, which is great. We don't have the capacity in my office to do a bunch of them. So we just encourage people or let people know, like, we will go through the first 10 and then we'll start from the beginning and we'll just rotate around and around. So even if you can't get in this time, we'll do it again in a few months and you can try then. But there's just myself and Tex Osvig in my office right now. So it makes it a little hard to do that for more. And I think we're pretty much at time. I don't know if there are final comments, or I'm always around, you know, if anybody ever wants to come talk to me about anything, I always encourage that. We aren't great at communicating. I'm really pushing for us to do more of that. But for those people at the college who like the Native American garden stuff, the Green Hall mural, if you just want to know what's going on, just call me. I will tell you. We may not have an official whatever yet, but I'm happy to give you the information that I can give you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jody. We really appreciated this. If anybody else has further questions, feel free to, like Jody said, reach out to her. Again, I'd like to put a plug in for if anybody's interested in volunteering to help put together these seminars, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Nick Phelps. Our emails are in the chat.